Can an international court of justice ruling help Gaza? Provisional measures demand Israel prevent acts of genocide, but do not call for a ceasefire. With no real obligation to abide by court rulings, could Israel continue its assault with impunity and even stop life-saving aid? I'm Andrea Sankin. Today's newsmaker is the ICJ's ruling on Israel. Well, it seemed like a victory for South Africa, attempting to prosecute Israel for the genocide of Palestinians at the ICJ. On Friday, the court issued provisional measures that acknowledged South Africa's accusations are plausible and insisted on increasing humanitarian measures to protect Gazans. But within just a few days of that ruling, 9 major donors of UNRWA, the UN agency providing crucial aid to Gaza, cut their funding. Then on Sunday, 12 Israeli government ministers and over a dozen lawmakers pledged to rebuild Jewish settlements in the Gaza Strip. So has a minor victory for Palestinians suffering under Israel's assault backfired? That debate in just a minute, but first, a look at the ICJ's ruling and the reaction to it.
Israel has been ordered by the International Court of Justice in its interim ruling to take steps to prevent genocide in Palestine.
The court considers that, with regard to the present situation, Israel must, in accordance with its obligations under the Genocide Convention, in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, take all measures within its power to prevent the commission of all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention.
The top UN court found South Africa's genocide accusation plausible and rejected Israel's application to drop the case. The ruling also said Israel must ensure delivery of humanitarian aid to civilians in Gaza. South African President Cyril Ramaphosa celebrated the court's provisional measures. And in The Hague, the country's foreign minister said she would have wanted a ceasefire included in the judgment.
I have no way that I'm going to say I'm disappointed. I hoped for it, but the fact of delivering humanitarian aid, the fact of taking measures that reduce the levels of harm against persons who have no role in what Israel is combating, for me, requires a ceasefire.
The US, on the other hand, said the allegations of genocide against Israel are unfounded. And Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejected the ruling, saying his country has the right to defend itself.
The vile attempt to deny Israel this fundamental right is blatant discrimination against the Jewish state, and it was justly rejected. The charge of genocide leveled against Israel is not only false, it's outrageous, and decent people everywhere should reject it.
Despite falling short of a ceasefire, many believe the ruling could bring some relief to Gaza and make the conflict more difficult for Israel. Yet on the same day of the ICJ ruling, there was a major setback for the Gazans desperately in need. The UN Humanitarian Agency for the Palestinian Territories opened an investigation after Israel's allegations of some of its employees' involvement in the October 7th attack. Israel has long accused UNRWA of helping Hamas. 9 out of 12 individuals reportedly involved in the attacks were fired by the UN body. After the announcement, the US, Germany, Switzerland and several other countries have frozen donations to the agency. UNRWA Commissioner Philippe Lazzarini said the suspensions are threatening the life-saving humanitarian work across the region.
I urge countries who have suspended their funding to reconsider their decisions before UNRWA is forced to suspend its humanitarian response. The lives of people in Gaza depend on this support, and so does regional stability.
Despite the ICJ ruling, Israel has continued to pound Gaza, killing more than 300 Palestinians over the weekend. The court's ruling is binding, but there is no real mechanism to enforce the orders. Yet it can still put pressure on Israel and its allies to refrain from carrying out horrific attacks. And for the Palestinians, it can raise hope for long-awaited justice.
So does this ruling bring hope to Palestinians, or instead the prospect of Israel cracking down even harder in response? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Cape Town, Ebrahim Rasool, the chair of the Development Bank of South Africa and a former South African ambassador to the United States. From Dublin is Michael Becker, a former associate lawyer at the International Court of Justice and an assistant professor of international human rights law at Trinity College Dublin. And from Pretoria, former South African diplomat and political analyst, Botsang Moiloa. Thanks all so much for being with me. You know, with no mechanism to enforce any of Friday's ICJ ruling and then years to go before a decision on genocide is actually made, Michael Becker, why is this a good thing for Palestinians?
Well, the decision's really important for a number of reasons. One, the fact that the court established that South Africa had put forward a case that is at least plausible, which was the test that South Africa would meet for the indication of provisional measures back on Friday. So I think even before we start to talk about what measures did the court impose, and is there any prospect of Israel changing its conduct in response to the court's order, that's already very important. That's already a rebuke to government officials, not only in Israel, who responded to South Africa's case by saying this is completely without any basis in fact. The court has said otherwise, and that changes the narrative. It also puts other states outside, beyond Israel, on notice that their conduct is also now, to some extent, under scrutiny, because the Genocide Convention also includes this idea of a duty to prevent genocide.
So, Botsang, do you think this is really a good thing, or is it good enough for what a court can deliver on legal grounds in a case like this?
Well, Andre, there's nothing like good enough when it lacks the teeth to bite. The decision is very positive for the Palestinian people, for South Africa, and for many other countries at large. It was a good legal decision, which is in the right direction and right step. However, I had wished that actually you would have, expressly, pronounced on the ceasefire, because that is the most important thing. I think it's victory for South Africa, but this is just one step ahead or towards the direction of trying to attain peace in the Middle East, and especially to hold, Israel from murdering the children of Palestine. And I don't say Hamas didn't kill any Israelis, but I think more could be done regarding this case. And we should also recall that this was just a preliminary decision. The judgment may take long and may come with more harsher measures. But the only disturbing part I had with it, I think the court or the jury, they've given Israel too much of a playroom, whereby they've left everything up to them instead of instructing them and ordering them to cease fire and for humanitarian purposes as well. But they've also led them to go and decide on how to do it. And they've given them, ample time, a month to can come back with a report. I think it's too much time, taking into account that violence still continues.
It is a preliminary decision. And let me turn to Ebrahim. The court may be doing the best it can in a legal sense, but the real-world implications of this decision could be quite different, could they not?
Look, I think I refuse to speak Netanyahu's language that this is a defeat because there is no ceasefire. I think the most important achievement is that Israel is under scrutiny. The Palestinians have a voice, that they were not making it up all these years, that they were suffering, that in fact there's a prima facie case that there is a genocide afoot, and that the prevention of genocide is the immediate priority of the court. That's what they could fashion out of a whole range of different interests. And very importantly, you cannot expect Turkeys to vote for Christmas. And if there are any number of former colonizing powers who would support the idea of genocide, there would be at least four fingers pointing back to the conduct of Germany, the conduct of the United States with the indigenous Americans and the African slaves, the conduct of Germany with regard to the Herero and the Nama in Southwest Africa or Namibia. And so I think the Pandora's box needs to be kept semi-closed, but the implications are such that it is no surprise that the backlash is one that will be supported by former colonizing powers, because they've got to get the Pandora's box closed again very quickly. Otherwise, they are in the dock for reparations arising out of historical colonial actions. And so maybe we shouldn't be too pessimistic, but Israel is under scrutiny. It's been kicked off the moral high ground. Its moral blackmail is sounding a lot more hollow. And I think that the Palestinians have been vindicated that their suffering is real.
Okay, then twofold question for Michael, because I'd like you to pick up on that Pandora's box issue that Ebrahim was just describing there, and that, you know, the other players involved could feel that they might be under further scrutiny if Israel is ruled against in a certain way. And then also, he mentioned the moral high ground here that many say Israel has now lost. Does Israel care about the moral high ground? Israel has always been able to ignore UN resolutions, international law. It's continuously violated international law prior to October 7th. Its resolve just seems to get stronger instead. So, again, is this a win for Palestinians if that has been the pattern?
Well, I'm not sure I can speak to whether Israel as a state cares about the moral high ground or not. I'm sure there are individuals within the Israeli government who do care about that. But I want to pick up on that point about the ceasefire and the disappointment that some have expressed about the fact that the court didn't go that far. I don't think that was ever a reasonable expectation. And that's because of the circumstances in which this conflict has arisen. Because the one thing Israel did very effectively at the hearing earlier this month was to show that Hamas poses a continuing and real threat. And the court wasn't going to make a decision that essentially seemed to prevent, to suggest to Israel, you have no legal right to protect the people of Israel. But I think that there's a silver lining in the fact, for those who might be disappointed by that outcome, I think there's a silver lining. First of all, by telling Israel that they need to ensure that no acts that could be genocidal take place, that combined with the instruction that Israel take all measures within its power to ensure the effective delivery of aid, I don't read that as a de facto ceasefire, which is how some have interpreted that. But I do think that it has to mean that Israel is expected now by the court to show far greater restraint in its military operation. The other benefit of the fact that the decision didn't go as far as some wanted, and that the court stuck very close to the law and its own precedent, is that I actually think this makes it easier, more feasible for states like the United States and other strong supporters of Israel to actually seize this opportunity to use the ICJ ruling as a way to put pressure on Israel. Now, the events of the weekend may not make that seem very promising, but I still think that's the way this is the best hope for how this decision can play out and actually have a meaningful impact.
Okay, Botsang, I'm going to come back to you then. I mean, do you see that silver lining that Michael was describing there?
Definitely, there is a silver lining on paper and on court records, and it's a positive outcome. You know, we should not think it's a negative outcome. It's a positive outcome, but I would like to add more on what you had said earlier, to say Israel has a history of defying international agreements, UN resolutions, and many other orders that have been placed on the table against it. So we should not get too excited and to think that Israel will voluntarily respect the decision of the court. If they don't, there are consequences, obviously. It may lead them to go to, the International Criminal Court or other UN bodies. It may call for sanctions of any sort against the state of Israel. But the question is, practically on the ground, will they respect the outcome of the court? Will they implement what the court has decided in this instance for humanitarian and for saving lives? And for us, that is what is important for the world as a whole, is whether Israel will respect the decision of the court. Yes, the court may come back later and other states to enforce that decision, but
Okay.
what are the chances?
But I mean, Botsang, let me ask you, what we've already seen shows that Israel really will not respect the decision of the court. They have no intention to. And then my question went further before, asking if you fear, as South Africa fears, this could actually backfire by strengthening Israel's resolve, feeling now further backed into a corner. The world is now against us. We know this. The court has shown that in this ruling. So now we have to act even more strongly in our own self-defense interests by kicking out aid organizations, by talking about new Israeli settlements in Gaza. Go ahead.
what they are going to do, and you are correct. Look at what happened from the day the decision was made. Israel continued to bomb and kill people in Palestine and other neighboring states. It went worse, actually, because now this matter is flowing into other neighboring states within the Gulf region. But also, as you state, forcing Israel in this instance, South Africa is not a military state whereby they can take up arms and engage Israel, which is being armed by the United States of America in this instance. But again, Andre, my concern is other states that are supporting South Africa. What are they doing in the instance of Israel checking out aid organizations that are supposed to be providing military aid? The exact purpose of the case. They actually went on rampage, and I can tell you what they are going to do, or they started doing it to strangle and stress other countries that are related with economic sanctions. They will start withdrawing. You know, in South Africa, for example, they've canceled their flights, direct flights from Tel Aviv to Johannesburg, and measures like that. So they are going to go on a full onslaught, not only militarily, but to strain and stress any country that is being seen to be supporting South Africa. And those are the things that we must guard against.
Yeah. Okay. Ebrahim, I want your thoughts on this. And I need you to comment also specifically when we talk about Israel's allies and how they should be responding. Should the United States care now? You worked in the United States. Give us your understanding of, how far you think the U.S. will now go to protect Israel, even if it makes the U.S. liable for violating international law, and why Washington really thinks it's in its own interest to continue this staunch, seems an understatement at this point, staunch support for Israel.
Look, I think that's a historical fact. That will be the kind of way in which Western powers will continue to support Israel. The difference is that since the ruling of the ICJ, Israel has no longer got the cover of being the victim of history, the victim of other aggressors. It has become the aggressor. And so it has been stripped of that. Secondly, what has happened also is that the United States' plan of normalization by the Arab states with Israel has clearly been shot out of the water, both by the conflict as well as by the ruling of the ICJ, because no Arab state would want to be associated with a prima facie genocidal state called Israel. So Israel may feel that it has to regain the victimhood that has gotten it so much in support in the world that it must evoke that in some way or the other. I think, on the other hand, a United States election with a whole groundswell of support for the Palestinians may make the United States recalculate, may want to make it restrain Israel sufficiently. But I think that sometimes U.S. decision makers have a strange way of acting, like they've done with the United Nations Relief and Works Organization funding and so forth. And so, in a sense...
You know what, Ebrahim, though, I'm sorry, I lost your sound for a second, but if I'm following you correctly, and you think a groundswell of support for Palestinians in the United States could manifest in an election coming up, that could be a terrible thing for the cause of Palestinians, because the only other alternative to what is happening with the administration now is a right-wing government that moved, the Israeli capital to Jerusalem against international opinion, that has gone very far to support not just Israel, but Benjamin Netanyahu and the right wing in Israel. So isn't that a serious concern going forward for Americans speaking out?
I think it is a serious concern, but it often translates as a matter of difference in style, not in substance. No one can give Israel more arms, more carte blanche than what Joe Biden has done under his president.
Trump probably could, though.
No, I'm sure he could, but there's just so much that could be absorbed in the Middle East. And I think that with the normalization program shot out of the water, I think the grand plan for the Middle East has imploded. And so, in a sense, it's back to the drawing board for whichever administration would come in. And certainly, I think that the ordinary people, not only in the United States, but across the Western capitals, I think is making a rethink possible, and hopefully a restraining effect should be exercised over Israel. Israel must go alone and isolate itself and be bloody-minded, as it seems intent to do.
Okay, yeah. Well, let me come back to Michael quickly, because, I mentioned earlier the 12 or so Israeli ministers, 15 lawmakers that are now talking about, in complete contravention of international law, building settlements again in Gaza. I want to listen to what Itamar Ben-Gvir actually had to say at their meeting on Sunday. Let's listen.
Today, everyone understands that retreat brings about war, and if we don't want another October 7th, we need to return home and control the territory, and yes, also to suggest a moral, logical, Torah-oriented solution to encourage voluntary immigration of Palestinians from Gaza and the death penalty for terrorists.
Israel's national security minister there, Michael. I mean, encouraging the, quote, voluntary emigration of Palestinians. Are they talking about, again, completely dismissing any international law, any respect? What does that symbolize to you right now, hearing that from active Israeli ministers?
Well, that meeting was extraordinary, and it sounded like a public event planning the commission of war crimes, which isn't what you would necessarily expect or certainly want to see on the day or day after the ICJ ruling. The more that Israel openly defies the ICJ's order, it's one thing for there to be arguments about whether Israel is meaningfully complying or not, but open defiance. This is essentially handing to South Africa more evidence that will make what is a high bar for South Africa to meet on the merits of this case. But if Israel responds in that way, they are helping South Africa's case and hurting their own cause in the long term in terms of this genocide case. So it was disturbing to see this meeting take place in combination with the timing of the defunding of the Relief Works Agency.
Mm-hmm. Botsang, go ahead.
As you correctly put it, Mike, the Israeli have given, even after the case and the hearing, the final judgment is not out. They've given South Africa more ammunition to can say to the world and to the court or the jury in this instance. You can even see that after the decision, how they continue to conduct themselves. But also, there is an element of disrespecting human life of Palestinians. To simply say in the middle of a war, and when you have been instructed to do everything under your powers, you can stop murdering or genocide and murdering people. You go on and you say to Palestinian people, and that's a very powerful minister in state security, and say, we are opening our doors for Palestinians to can come and be Israeli citizens, they can immigrate into Israel, as if they are putting a blind eye on the historical fact that part of the dispute in Gaza or in the West Bank is the occupation of the Palestinian land. Now you have occupied the land of the Palestinians, and you rise when you are being told to stop murdering them and say they can immigrate to become part of us. But who said the Palestinians want to be Israelis in this instance? I find it very arrogant and cheeky of them to be doing that. But even if we go and we look at what transpired after, you chase away people who are supposed to give humanitarian aid to those Palestinians, but you are opening the corridor for the Palestinians to become your citizens. So how controversial. They could have actually said, we'll open for the aid, offerers to go and help those people of Palestine, instead of starving them and killing them and saying, now you can come and join us and be free citizens of Israel. And I think that's some of the signals to the world. What is Israel intending to do with the court decision? And they've started disregarding it within the first few hours of the decision being out. And I don't think I'm going to expect any positive thing from Israel. It is up to the world to put more pressure on Israel and its allies. Earlier on, you mentioned how the American elections are going to have an impact on this. Let me agree with Ambassador. I don't think the American politics or elections are going to be affected that much domestically by this court decision. I'll tell you why. The relationship of Israel and America, it doesn't matter which party in the U.S. has been in power, whether it's the Democrats or the Republicans.
We're down to our last 45 seconds. Ebrahim, I saw you wanting to get in. Go ahead.
I just want to add one important thing. One of the rulings of the ICJ is that individuals who foment genocide, whether it's the killing or the depopulating of Palestinian lands, must be held accountable. And if I can say that what individual ministers and government leaders in Israel are doing is to open themselves up to charges at the International Criminal Court. And that is one avenue that South Africa will definitely pursue as we go forward, because every minister cannot just say what they want to in response to the ICJ ruling.
Okay, we'll see if South Africa goes that far, especially after it kind of dismissed the jurisdiction of the ICC, but that's for another discussion. Okay, unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers, so I'd like to thank all three of my panelists sincerely so much for being with us. Our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.